Welcome to the 2021 Churchill College Distinguished Lecture in Computer Science. We have had these lectures for a number of years now. In previous years we've had them in March at the end of Lent term, but because of the circumstances we decided to delay it to today, which we thought would be the end of lockdown. And now that hasn't happened, but of course we're pressing ahead regardless. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have as our guest speaker Ron Rivest from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, someone that we've known for many years. Now, Ron first came to my attention back in 1997, in fact, in my last year as an undergraduate, when he, together with Adi Shamir and Len Adelman, published a paper that he's going to talk about today, where he came up with a really cool idea about how you could use number theory in cryptography. And this was of interest to me because I was doing maths and number theory was my strong point. Later on, I ended up doing cryptography for a bank, and later on still I did research in the subject and started working in the field and got to know Ron. The whole thing is a fascinating story about how a mathematical idea turned into a system. The system spawned a company, it facilitated a whole industry, and it led to all sorts of ramifications, further research, and other cool ideas that followed from it. So Ron's going to talk about how all this happened for about 45 or 50 minutes, and thereafter we're going to have a question and answer session. The question and answer session will be in the Q&A, which you can see at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. I'll moderate the questions. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ron Rivest, who's a professor of computer science at MIT. Ron, great to see you again.
Well, great to see you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you and the organizers for this invitation to give this distinguished lecture at the Churchill College. I'm very pleased to be here virtually as best I can. I wish I could be there in person, but travel is difficult these days still, but Zoom makes it work well. So congratulations to all of you that are graduating. I understand some of you are graduating, and so congratulations and best wishes for your success in your career. And for those who are not graduating, or already graduated, or are going to be graduating a bit later, again, success to you in your careers. Today, I'd like to talk about RSA, and let me share my screen so that we can do that. Is that visible to everybody?
That's good. We see the title slide.
Excellent, good. So the topic is the RSA public key crypto system, which is a invention that I participated in with Adi Shamir and Len Adelman back in 1977. And I'd like to give the history of that and some of its future developments. So I've got a set of slides here, the outline. So we've got some context. All of this happens in the context of prior work on number theory and cryptography, so we'll talk a little bit about that. The invention of public key cryptography, which was done at Stanford, and RSA, which was done at MIT. We'll talk about that. Early steps to push this technology out, and the transition from academic research to a cryptographic business, and how that happened. Along the way, we saw that there were many difficulties, one of which was the politics or the policies of the government with respect to cryptography and the desire not to have cryptography in widespread use. We'll talk about that. Attacks, technical attacks on the RSA system and others. The resurgence of some of these policy issues, which are still going on, and some discussion of looking towards the future. So that's the outline. We'll start with some pre-1976 context. In fact, let's go all the way back to the Greeks. Euclid in 300 BC showed that there were infinitely many primes, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and prime numbers are the bread and butter of much of cryptography these days. And so the ability to understand primes and their properties and find them and use them is critical. In addition to talking about primes, he showed how to find the greatest common divisor of two numbers. So if we have 12 and 30, for example, the biggest number that divides both of them evenly is 6, and that's easily computed using an algorithm that Euclid developed. And that's said by Knuth to be the world's first algorithm. So if you're studying computer science, an algorithm you should probably have in your toolkit this is a reference point, but it's actually very useful, as we'll see later too. Greeks also used cryptography. One of the techniques they used was to take a message, write it on a long leather strip, and wrap that strip around a stick of a diameter that was known only to the sender and the receiver. And so the period of the cipher was relative to the ratio between the circumference of the stick and the size of the letters. And if you wrap the letters around just the right way, you'd see the message appear. Finding periods in crypto systems turns out to be critical and is one of the weaknesses of RSA with respect to quantum computers, as we'll see. So periodicity is a key factor in much of cryptography. Moving ahead many centuries, we see some relevant number theory appearing. Pierre de Fermat conjectured, he's called Fermat's little theorem. He actually didn't prove it. Usually theorems are referred to as facts that have proof. He didn't prove this. He was an amateur mathematician, but he observed that for any prime p and any number a that's relatively prime to p, that is to say doesn't share any divisors with p, or a between 1 and p minus 1 inclusive, that a to the power p minus 1 is equal to 1 mod p. So 2 to the 6th power, for example, is equal to 1 mod 7. And so that's a fact which cryptographers love, because anytime you get the identity back, you can break it into two parts and get an operation in its inverse. So a to the p minus 2 times a gives you 1 back, and so a to the p minus 2 is a inverse mod p. Anyway, so that's the first theorem. We'll use that in the development of RSA. Now, that fact was generalized by Leonhard Euler, who was one of the world's great mathematicians, who not only proved this fact, but generalize it. So if the two numbers a and n have no common divisors, then a to the phi of n is congruent to 1 mod n. If n is prime, then phi of n is just p minus 1, but otherwise phi of n is just the number of x's less than n that share no common divisors with n. So that fact we'll be using in the development of RSA as well. So the number theory was there. It was ready to use. It wasn't being used for cryptographic purposes at the time, but facts such as these are critical to the development of RSA. Moving forward a bit further, one of the world's greatest ever mathematicians, called Frederick Gauss, lived in the late 18th century, 19th century, wrote at age 21, he was a boy genius, in Disquisitione Arithmeticae, the following statement. He said, the problem of distinguishing prime numbers from composite numbers, those that are not prime, the problem of distinguishing prime numbers from composite numbers and of resolving the latter into their prime factors is known to be one of the most important and useful in arithmetic. The dignity of science itself seems to require solution of a problem so elegant and so celebrated. So he was right on the money here. He says this is important, but he conflated these two problems of telling whether a number is prime or not from telling whether how to factor a non-prime number into its prime factors, which can be done only one way. It turns out that one of these is easy. Finding a prime number is easy, telling whether it's prime or not. But if it's not prime, telling what its factors are is hard. And we rely on this distinction in the development of RSA as well. So Gauss was right in the money here. He said primality is real important. Telling whether something is prime or not is going to be important. And being able to factor might also be important. But he didn't have cryptographic applications in mind either. Jevons is not as well known among the computer science community. He was an engineer and a prolific writer. He wrote in the Principles of Science, 1874, he gave the world's very first factoring challenge. And I love this because factoring challenges are part of what we do with RSA these days. He said, what two numbers multiplied together will produce 861 646 0799, which is as long as a 10-digit phone number in the US. I think it unlikely that anybody but myself will ever know, right? So he actually multiplied two numbers together and said, nobody will ever know the product. And this was factored in 1903 by Derek Lamer using one of his infamous factoring machines, 89681 times 96079. This is a number you can check the product on your calculator on your smartphone now, and you can even factor a number like this on your smartphone. So these are short numbers by comparison to the sizes of numbers we use today for the RSA, which might be hundreds of digits long. Jevons thought this would be too big. computer science and algorithms of factoring have evolved a great deal since his time. Moving ahead, we get to still establishing context. In World War I, we have the worldwide use of radio, a new communications technology, which was marvelous for the armed forces. It enabled instantaneous communication with remote ships and forces, but also gave all transmitted messages to the enemy. So you broadcast something, you say attack at dawn or whatever, the enemy can hear that if it's not somehow hidden. And so cryptography started to be used widely because of radio. Radio was a wonderful communication technology, but it broadcast to everybody, the good guys and the bad guys included. And so you needed some way to distinguish the good guys from the bad guys. And cryptography turned out to be just the right tool for this. Cryptography doesn't always work. And during this talk, I'd like to emphasize the contributions made by you all, the British. And there was during the 1917 period, there was a decipherment of a message that was coded called the Zimmerman Telegraph, where Germany promised to Mexico that it would give Mexico, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas if they didn't participate in the war on the side of the Americans. This caused the Americans to get involved with the war for sure, and led to Germany's defeat probably. So this had a major impact on the course of the war. Alan Turing, who was just down the street from you all at King's College, was one of the key figures in the development of cryptography and computation as well. He developed the foundations of the theory of computability, the Turing machine, which is still in widespread use in theory to talk about classes of computation and what can be computed, what can't be computed. We're still learning about his contributions during the war. He made many contributions of a statistical nature, some of which are still classified. One of the things he worked on, interestingly, was the breaking of the German rotor machines, the naval Enigma Purple, JN25, and so on too. Machines look like this. You punch the keys on the keyboard. They went through a series of rotors, which you can see in this machine as it's opened up, and another light would light up. This machine was very complicated. The circuitry went through various permutations. Those rotors rotated in odometer style, and they each implemented a permutation. And they were quite complicated. In addition, there was a plug board in the front and so on. So these machines were used by the Germans to encrypt their communications. But as you probably know, Alan Turing and others at Bletchley Park, where you have a wonderful museum, I look forward to going back and seeing the renovations that have happened recently there. And William Friedman and others in the US broke this machine and had the plaintext of the German communications readable all the same. And this had a major impact on the war. It's estimated that the war was shortened by many months, if not at least a couple of years, because of this development of cryptographic impact. So in addition to that, this effort involved the building of early computers. The Colossus, as it was called, was one of the first digital devices used to break this machine and as a prototype for some of the early computational devices. It's all nicely summarized in David Kahn's wonderful book, The Code Breakers, which I recommend to you if you want an introduction to cryptography. He published The Code Breakers, The Story of Secret Writing. This is a book which NSA did not like. It was felt for many years by those in the code breaking agencies that the widespread knowledge of how codes worked and how they could be broken should be kept secret. And so the NSA attempted to suppress this publication. But in the US, we have a free press, and this book came out all the same and had a major impact on academic research because people could then go look and see what had been done before. I recommend this book to you. So as we get into the 70s, we're getting closer to the point of public key now, but not quite. The United States government decided that there would be, there's a need for a encryption scheme, a US standard encryption scheme. If you're going to have an encryption scheme, it should be standardized. The sender and the receiver need to use the same algorithm. And so we have a need for some sort of standard to encrypt messages. They put out calls. The first call didn't yield anything interesting. The second call yielded an algorithm which is diagrammed here, which later became the data encryption standard designed by IBM, by Horst Weisdell. And it has this wonderful ladder structure where you can put in nonlinear boxes at every step and still be able to decrypt. I won't describe that in detail now, but the deal apparently made by the NSA with IBM was that they will help the design be as strong as it could be for that design, as long as the key size was kept at 56 bits, which if you do the math is just about what you could break with a basement full of computers, which is what NSA had at the time. So they sort of kept the technology from being as strong as it might be, but it was still a better fence than existed previously. There was much controversy about the design of DES at the time. At the same time this standard came out, we now get to the invention. Oh, sorry, I forgot this slide. There's a parallel work happening at the same time with computational complexity. And this is also key to the development of RSA. It was clear that one could compute many things, but that some things took more time than others. And so the question arose naturally, what things are hard to compute, what things are easy to compute? For example, is factoring a large number into its prime factors hard or easy, or other problems? And so there developed a whole field of computational complexity where we began to study specific problems and ask for each problem, is this an easy problem? Can it be done in polynomial time and the length of the input? Or is it a hard problem which takes time, say exponential in the length of the input or worse? And these folks, Gary Sarmanis, Dick Stearns, Manny Blum, Steve Cook, Dick Karp, were one of the key developers of this theory. Polynomial time reductions and the theory of NP completeness were part and parcel of this whole development. So understanding how hard it was for a computation was the question being asked. And this is a key question with cryptography because you want to have the adversary be faced with a hard computational problem in order to read the email that's been encrypted for which he doesn't have the key. So now let's move to the invention of public key and the invention of RSA. So Ralph Merkle on the left here, you see this picture of Whit Diffie on the right and Marty Hellman in the center. Independently, well, Ralph Merkle and independently Marty and Whit invented the notion of public key cryptography. We'll talk about what that means to them moving forward. But they had the notion, they wrote it up, and that was what inspired us to work. They wrote a paper, which I recommend that you read. It's still very readable, called New Directions in Cryptography. And the opening sentence says, "We are at the brink of a revolution in cryptography." And they predicted that. And in fact, their paper was what, if you like, caused that revolution. They laid out the ideas and the agenda for a research program in cryptography, which we followed up on. And really, there has been a revolution in cryptography. They proposed the idea of public key encryption. And let me describe that to you as they saw it. It's not quite the same as we view it today because there's other things that get added today like randomization. So these are deterministic operations. The way they see it, each party A has a public key, call it P sub A, that others can use to encrypt messages to A. So there's an operator, I just write the operator as PK sub A on a message M, which yields you a ciphertext C. So that's the encryption operator. So there's a public key, that is to say, can be known by the public. Anybody can encrypt a message to go to A and yield a corresponding ciphertext C. Each party A then has a secret key, SK sub A, for decrypting such a received ciphertext C. So M is C is operated on by the secret key to yield the message M, and get the message back. So these two keys, PK sub A and SK sub A, correspond to operations that are inverses of each other. What one does, the other undoes. And the interesting thing is that, first of all, it's easy to compare, easy to compute matching public key, secret key pairs, but it's also the fact that publishing the public key does not compromise the secret key. I can tell you what my public key is, and you can encrypt messages to me, but that doesn't allow you to decrypt messages that have been encrypted by somebody else to be sent to me. So that's the requirement that Diffie and Hellman proposed. So it's computationally infeasible to obtain the secret key from the public key. And so we see this notion of computational infeasibility come up again. This is in the realm of computational complexity. Each public key could then be listed in a public directory, which is like a big phone book, is how Diffie and Hellman imagined it, with the owner's name. So if you want to encrypt a message to me, you look up my public key in the phone book, and you get that public key, and you encrypt a message to me, and I can decrypt it using my secret key, and you can't, and nobody else can decrypt it. Only I can decrypt messages encrypted with my public key. More interestingly, they proposed, at least to me, they proposed the idea of a digital signature. This is really a new idea. Encryption had been around for a long time, But the idea of a digital signature is really a public key only kind of notion, and they showed how it could be done using the fact that the secret key and the public key implement these inverse operations. So you sign a message with your secret key. So you end up with a signature that depends on the message being signed and on something that only you know, which is your secret key. So you produce a signature using those two, and somebody else can verify that it's your signature using your public key that you posted in the directory. So if A wants to produce a signature sigma for a message M, A just applies the secret key to the message to obtain something we'll call the signature. So the signature is a transformation of the message that A can perform, but nobody else can perform. And then anybody else who would like to can figure out how to verify this message by undoing it using the public key. You can take the public key, apply it to the signature, and see if you get the message back. And if that identity holds, then you say, yes, that's a valid signature for the message M. So that's the original idea for a public key signature scheme. And we've evolved this more recently to involve randomization and other niceties that you need for making it secure. But the basic idea is still the same, that you sign with your secret key and you allow other people to verify your signature with your public key. And so you can sign all kinds of messages. The messages aren't protected, they're not private. Anybody can get the message back from the signature, but they're verified as coming from you and being a signature for that particular message. These are amazing ideas, but Diffie and Hellman proposed these ideas. They said this is a framework for research, a framework for evolving cryptography, but they actually had no ideas on how to implement these ideas. And the paper was an interesting one because it very much proposed this as an agenda for research, as a set of open problems. Can you actually build a public key crypto system? Is it possible to publish a public key without revealing thereby the secret key? These were unknown questions at the time. And then I had a graduate student pass me the paper of Diffie and said, Ron, you might be interested in this. So we became interested. In fact, I got two of my colleagues together. That's me in the middle there with the heavy glasses, Adi Shamir on the left and Ronald Edelman on the right. And we were all young assistant professors at MIT at the time. And we decided to pick up this agenda and look at it, see if we could come up with ideas for implementing a public key crypto system. And at times we were discouraged and said, oh, this is probably impossible. We tried to prove it was impossible. We failed at that. We actually came up with a proposal. They were in the same room, the same lab, as I said, but not the same department. They were in the math department. So Adi and I actually proposed quite a few methods, and Len, who's better at cryptanalysis, said, oh, that won't work, this won't work. He was able to break a lot of them. Until finally we came up with one that actually worked. Well, Adi came up with one while he was on a ski trip once. We were up in Vermont and Adi was skiing, and he's at the top of the hill. He said, it was February 77. He remembers solving the public key problem while skiing. But then when he got to the bottom of the hill, he couldn't remember anymore what the solution was. So we have no idea anymore what he thought of. Might have been the same as RSA. Probably it was a different scheme. Who knows? Maybe someday Adi will remember it. So we were thinking all the time while we were skiing and so on too. The actual invention of RSA happened after a Seder dinner at the home of one of the graduate students in our group, Bonnie Bruce. And we might give a toast here for some wine. So I think some wine helped loosen the thinking gears. And Nino Veritas said Pliny in AD 50. So there was some wine drunk at the party. Afterwards, I was settling down, reviewing some of the ideas we'd gone over, and having had some Manischewitz wine, and thinking about permutation polynomials and factoring and so on too. And actually the ideas gelled in a particular way in my head at the time, that it was based on all the work we've been doing together. So we came up with a proposal for RSA. So RSA, let's talk about that. Some of you have seen this already, some of you may not. Let's go through the details. They're not complicated, really. It's a fairly simple idea. The parts go together and it seems to hold together well. So the security relies in part on the inability of an adversary to factor. So we're making a computational assumption here that if we take two large primes, P and Q, and multiply them together to come up with a number n, we can publish n without thereby revealing the prime factors that went into it, the P and Q. So that's an assumption we're making, and that assumption could turn out to be false. It might turn out that factoring is easy, but we don't know that yet. It seems factoring actually is hard. So the public key turns out to be two numbers. One is this n that you can create by multiplying two large prime numbers together. And the other is a number E, which we'll be using as an exponent. And that just has to be relatively prime to phi of n, where phi of n is the number of, as before, the number of numbers less than n that are relatively prime to n. Actually, phi of n is just p minus 1 times q minus 1 in this case. We throw out all the multiples of p and q. So E is easy to create. It could be a small prime number. It's often 3 or do the 16 plus 1 or something like that. And the secret key, so that's the public key. We publish n, we publish E. Secret key is another number E, which is the multiplicative inverse of E modulo phi of n. And using Euclid's algorithm or an extension of that, we can compute that easily. So D times E is congruent to 1 mod phi of n. And that's easy to compute, given E and given n, given phi of n. So then RSA are these two very simple equations. You encrypt the message M by raising it to the eth power mod n. You can do repeated squaring or some other efficient algorithm to raise M to a very large power. So M is a residue mod n, and we raise it to the power E. E could be a smallish number, or it could be a larger number, but we get up to high powers quite quickly by repeated squaring, and we compute in such a way the number C, which is the encryption, the ciphertext corresponding to the message n, for that public key. You can see the public key is used in both parts of this equation. The E is the exponent of M, and N is the modulus that we're reducing by. So the computation of the ciphertext given M, E, and N is relatively straightforward. Well, not so easy, especially at the time. It was hard. It was a big computation and had to be a big number to keep it from being factored. And so this was not a trivial operation, but it was quite doable. Normally, decryption, given the secret key, D, and again, the modulus n, is just raising to the dth power mod n. So we take the ciphertext received, raise it to the dth power, and we end up with the message m that was originally started with. Two very simple equations. These keys operate in inverse manner, so that what you encrypt with the public key could be decrypted with the public key, or if you're doing signatures, you could operate it with use the second equation first to compute a signature, and then verify with the first equation. So that's how RSA works. That's the proposal. So we didn't know at the time how secure this would be. I mean, the art of factoring was really a backwaters kind of study at the time. Not too many people were looking at it. It had been studied some. We were looking around to find people who knew about factoring or knew about people who were working on factoring. So we talked to Martin Gardner, who just knows everything and everybody. He has this wonderful column which inspired many of us to go into computer science, called Mathematical Games, which appeared in Scientific American. So we talked to him, and he said, "Oh, I want to write about this for one of my columns." So we worked with him for the August issue of 1977 to write about RSA. And in that paper, in that article, he offered a copy of the RSA technical memo to anybody who wrote into it for it. And we offered $100 to the first person to break a particular challenge ciphertext based on 129 product of primes. And we estimated, based on what we knew about factoring at the time, that it would take 40 quadrillion years for anybody to factor that 129-digit number. So as you'll see, we were way off on that, but still, it was a challenge that stood for quite a while. So we published those challenges, and we published the memo, which we sent out to people who wrote after the lawyers said it was okay. There was some concern about it possibly violating export restrictions. And then we published in the communications of the ACM. So that's the first page of the paper that we wrote. Actually, we were thinking about offering an NFT based on the first page of the paper, but we haven't done that yet. That's on the side. So another thing that the paper did, which may last longer than RSA, we'll see, is that Alice and Bob were introduced in the paper as an expository thing. So we take credit for introducing Alice and Bob to the world of cryptography. So Alice would send Bob her public key, and Bob would send back an encryption of a message M. And this was the start of Alice and Bob. Now they have a life of their own. They appear in almost every cryptographic paper. There are hundreds of papers, if not thousands. There's XKCD cartoons about them, and they have their own Wikipedia page that you can look up. So Alice and Bob have become really standard figures in the world of cryptography, and they made their first appearance in the RSA paper. It's a wonderful expository device because you can talk about he and she and use pronouns and so on and so forth. So hi to Alice and Bob. So going along with the connection to England and Britain, in 1999, it was announced that the same inventions had appeared by James Ellis, Clifford Cox, and Malcolm Williams. So they were working the classified domain. They invented the RSA algorithm, the public key cryptography, the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which I haven't described here. In the 1970s, a bit before their invention outside by us. So they deserve credit too for inventing these things. They didn't push it very far. They put it mostly in a drawer and said, "Oh, that's interesting, but not too practical." And they did not invent the notion, as far as I understand, of digital signature, which I think is one of the major contributions of the Diffie-Hellman paper. Early steps, what happened? Well, so after the idea was published, there were many technical developments. One of the most interesting ones appeared in a bachelor's thesis by Lauren Kohnfelder, who was working with Len Edelman. Proposed the notion of a digital certificate, a digitally signed message attesting to another party's public key. So I could sign Alice's public key and say, Alice's public key is this. And then if you trust me and trust my signature, then you can develop trust in that bonding between Alice's name and Alice's public key. So the idea of a certificate first appeared in 1978 in this thesis, and you now have certificates all the time in your browsers. I'm sure most of you are familiar with managing your certificates for various parties that you talk to regularly on the web. As I said, the computation of RSA was non-trivial. It took many minutes on the slow VAX computers we had at the time to actually do, particularly to find prime numbers, but actually to do the RSA computation too. And so MIT was just starting to get involved with the VLSI business at the time. So we said, okay, let's try building an RSA chip. And we designed this chip that you see laid out here. It had multipliers for multiplying big numbers together, up to 512 bits. It did prime finding and even a followed row factorization method. Had 40,000 transistors. So it was, we had it fabbed, had some copies, but it didn't quite work. There was some electrical problems with the design. We still don't know what exactly, but it didn't quite work. But it was an early prototype saying, yeah, this could be done easily on VLSI circuitry. And in fact, many CPUs now have just with all the miniaturization that's going on, have a portion of their chip devoted to doing RSA type computations. So it's quite easy to implement now. But a little bit of coprocessor help or extra circuitry can help make this system go faster. But even nowadays, RSA computation on a standard CPU is quite easy. At the time, it was very much slower. Well, there's some technical. Then we took the ideas and said, can we turn this into a business somehow? Is there really a market for this? We didn't know anything about business. We set up a company in 1983. There was a patent filed by MIT. As you can see, it was filed for in 77, but it wasn't issued until 1983. There was some interesting interference operation things happening in the patent office between Stanford patents, which talked broadly about public key, maybe a bit too broadly, and then the RSA patent. So we settled those and worked things out. And so that patent was issued in 1983. It expired in the year 2000. But it talks about the algorithms needed for implementing RSA. 1983, when the patent issued, we set up a company. Len Edelman was president. We had no idea what we were doing at the time. This slide describes the set of activities that happened at the time. There was nothing going on. There was no market. We didn't know what to do about setting up a business. Finally, we hired Jim Bidzos, and Jim was a master, and still is, a master salesman. He turned out to be a good friend and colleague. He really is the one who drove this business forward. He said, let's take this idea, let's try to make a company out of it. So he joined in '86. At the time, there were many challenges, as we'll see, but he knew how to close a deal, he knew how to suss out a market, how to create a market, and was really influential at making all this happen. One of the key sales he made was to IBM, which was working with a startup called Lotus in 1987. And that really saved the company and kept us going. We were living on fumes for a long time with little revenue income. And then he was able to sign a sequence of deals with Motorola, Apple, Novell, Netscape when the web came on, Microsoft, and so on too. So he was able to turn this nascent technical idea into a business and start selling software packages that implemented all of this. He also started the RSA conferences, which is still running strong. It started in '91. There's about 50,000 people a year that show up to them now. And there's a good cryptography track, as well as many, many industry tracks and government tracks. So that's become one of the standard venues for cryptographic research. He also spun out VeriSign, which he still chairs and runs in '95. Verisign was devoted to the certificate business initially, worked on online certificate status checks to say whether a certificate is still valid, and it still handles the DNS requests, many billions of these a day. So it's a trusted third party that manages the security aspects of many businesses. RSA turned out to be acquired or merged with Security Dynamics in 1996, which was bought by EMC in 2006. Most recently, it was RSA was spun out to Symphony Technology Group. So it continues to have a life, but it's part of a bigger picture of security corporations. So we talked about radio. Let me talk about the World Wide Web. So one of the things that really made cryptography work in the commercial, cryptography needed in the commercial world, was the World Wide Web, which was invented by this fellow, Tim Berners-Lee, who's down the hall from me at MIT at CSAIL. But he invented the World Wide Web while he was at CERN. Layered on top of the internet, as you've seen all the web pages, you know what the web is like. But this guy made the first steps. And I like to draw the analogy that the World Wide Web was real, cryptography was really much the same that radio was. It's a new communications medium. It was pretty much public, so anybody could listen in and see what other people were doing. And because of the need for all this commercial traffic to do online shopping and so on, there was a need for cryptography that was met by public key cryptography primarily first, and then regular cryptography to do the bulk data encryption, because public key cryptography was still slow for the bulk data. But this invention of the World Wide Web cemented the transition of cryptography from primarily military to primarily commercial. This guy takes the credit for that. Along the way, we had many instances where the evolution of cryptography wasn't a natural technical flow from academic brainstorms to commercial markets. There were people who were troubled by the promulgation of cryptography in the wider spheres. These people were primarily at the time in the US government, the NSA, and their intelligence operations felt hampered by the use of public key cryptography, because now people would be encrypting in ways that they might not be able to read. Similarly, law enforcement, as we'll see, felt troubled by this too, because criminals might be using public key cryptography to hide their operations. There was an attempt made to show that these operations were in violation of the export regulations. Those were shown to be non-applicable because of the research exemptions in ITAR, but that kept us from mailing out those resumes for, not the resumes, the brochures for the reports for RSA back in the early days. And MIT even set up a committee headed by Mike Dufuzos, who's head of our lab, trying to articulate what MIT's stance would be in terms of cryptographic research. And MIT came out strongly saying, this is the kind of research that needs to be done. It's important for national security and for the commercial world to have good cryptography, and they support it. So that was nice to see. All the same, the government kept marching ahead and trying to enforce some way that they would be able to read the messages that were encrypted with public key or other crypto systems. They proposed in particular a kind of chip that they wanted everybody to have called the Clifford chip. And inside of that chip was a access mechanism which allowed them to read the mail. That turned out to be a flawed proposal. Matt Blaze took that apart rather quickly. And given that that went down sort of in flames, it seemed the crypto wars were over, and strong crypto was recognized as necessary for both commerce and national security. That was a misappreciation of the situation, that these crypto wars, if you like, are still continuing, and government agencies still tend to be pushing for access. Attacks. There were some attacks on RSA. That number, RSA 129, the 129-digit RSA number we put into Scientific American. Here's the number itself. If you can't factor it on your calculator right now, which you shouldn't be able to do, it's a hard number. It was factored by Derek Atkins, Michael Graf, and Arian Lenstra, Paul Leyland, into these two, the product of these two prime numbers. So they undid what we thought would take 40 quadrillion years to do, came up with this factorization. They were able to read the message that we encrypted there. Their work was in parallel. It had about 600 volunteers. It was a great use of the internet for distributed computation, about 5,000 MIPS years. And they read the secret message, which the was the magic words are squeamy sausage, which is a message we never expected to see. And squeamy sausage were just two words we picked out of the dictionary to give us some authentication that they had the right message. So they were able to do that. We had a party for them to factor that. We printed out on the long strip of paper the number they factored. There's me on the left, and Derek Atkins and Arian Lenstra in the middle there, and Paul Ayland rather, and then Mike Paul Ayland on the right. So those are the fellows that did it. And they have t-shirts saying the magic words is Screamy Sausage. Well, as factoring goes, this is where we got to today. We started off with a factory of 129-digit number back then. Today, as of last year, a 250-digit number has been factored by a team of people, some of the same people, in fact. And that's what we see as the state of the art of factoring. People are using, in fact, very commonly 600 and some digit numbers, those 2048-bit primes, 2048-bit products of primes. And so there's a substantial gap there. We don't know whether this curve is going to plateau like this or it's going to start shooting up. Security of RSA depends on this. There are always bigger numbers to use, of course, but if factoring turns out to be polynomial time, that won't help much. Moreover, there's a concern about quantum computation. Peter Shor, who's at MIT in the math department, developed a fast factorization algorithm that runs on a quantum computer. Quantum computers are quite different than regular computers, and instead of dealing with ones and zeros, they deal with superpositions of ones and zeros, where the weighted sums, where the two coefficients of the sum are complex numbers. And this factorization algorithm, like the breaking of the Skitale back there, the Greek scheme, works by determining the multiplicative period of elements mod n. So periodicity RSA has some periodicities, and quantum computers are perfectly set up to determine such periodicity. So if we can build a large enough quantum computer, RSA will definitely die because it doesn't provide the security that's wanted. It's not clear whether we can build big quantum computers yet, and there's some folks who think that maybe that will never happen, and I hope it never happens myself. I'd like to see RSA stay around for a while, but who knows? You have to live with the facts. We've factored the number 15 into 3 times 5 with a quantum computer so far, and more recently, the product of 2 3-digit prime numbers has been factored. So we'll see where it goes. Maybe there's dark clouds here on the horizon for RSA. Crypto wars continue. The FBI in particular wanted to break into an Apple phone that had been confiscated during a particular terrorist attack, and they would like to have the ability to read data on phones that have been confiscated by people involved in terrorism or other crimes. And there's a nice paper that came out I recommend that you read called Keys Under Doormats, which talks about a lot of the issues there and the difficulty of trying to implement such a access scheme for government. There are more recent proposals, and there's a successor to Keys Under Doormat paper coming out, which we'll talk about some of those as well. So this issue has not gone away. We continue to debate with government what the right level of access might be for these kinds of concerns. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to build a scheme which gives government access and doesn't give somehow the bad guys access as well. So what's next? Still lots of issues in this field. Is factoring really hard? I get email about once a week with somebody who says, I've got a new factoring algorithm. And I say, okay, I'm not going to read your paper right now, but here's a list of challenge numbers. Tell me the biggest one you can factor, and come back when you've got something that's interesting. And either they don't come back or they say, well, I need some help debugging my code. Can you help me, or whatever? So factoring still seems to be hard, at least on a standard computer. On quantum computers, well, we need to know if quantum computing practical. We don't know yet. There are many companies trying to build quantum computers. There's a lot of hype about quantum computers. We don't know if they're really going to be there. If they can be built, they may only break RSA and not do much else useful. We'll see. Although there's a list of problems for which they can be applied. They're not just faster general purpose computers. They're very particular kinds of things. People don't appreciate that. Then if they can build quantum computers, we want to know what crypto systems are quantum safe. How can we protect ourselves against advances in computation that quantum computers are around? And NIST have taken up the ball and said, let's try to standardize on some schemes that seem to be secure against quantum computation, and there's many proposals for lattice-based crypto systems and so on. So there's a great field of research there, building crypto systems that are quantum safe. So the field has blossomed tremendously since then. There are many, many crypto conferences every year, thousands of papers written every year, lots and lots of things happen, many of them number theory based. There's applications such as Bitcoin and many of the payment systems which have used cryptography in interesting ways. And cryptography is still one of the main tools for securing your crypto systems, securing your computers against adversarial attack. It's not enough by itself, and there's lots of systems level attacks that are still viable. But cryptography is one of the strong points of the toolkit we have. So research in cryptography is a fascinating blend of mathematics, statistics, theoretical computer science, computational complexity, that is, EE, psychology, and so on too. In policy, there's a lot of interesting questions at all levels. So it's really does the whole vertical stack from hardware security to how people think about the security of the systems they're using day to day. So cryptography is definitely here to stay. We use it every day for e-commerce. And depending on how quantum computing evolves, RSA may or may not be around for a while. People are preparing for it to go away and replacing it with other things, which is good. Quantum computing may happen. But personally, I'd like to see quantum computing remain a theoretical possibility and a practical impossibility, but that's just me. So cryptography is a lot of fun. So I encourage you that are thinking about career paths to consider cryptography as something you might get involved in, either as a profession or an avocation. Certainly something everybody should know about if you're building computer systems. So let me stop there, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you for your attention. And Ross, I think you were going to handle questions for me.
Yes, thanks, Ron, for a great talk. If you want to put any questions to Ron, please put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of the Zoom screen in the toolbar. And just to kick things off, Ron, we've talked about the possibility of whether in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time somebody might eventually make a quantum computer work well enough to factor numbers of real interest. Tell me, what are the longest, what systems do you know of which rely on RSA signatures for the longest cover time, the longest period of time? Would these be systems that sign code, for example, in consumer durables?
Perhaps, yeah. I think that military and diplomatic communications are probably the places where these things would be the longest period, right? If you have a message that you've sent and you want to maintain the secrecy of that message for decades, you want to encrypt it now, to be decrypted now, and you don't want the adversary to find out now. But even 20 or 30 years from now, it may be advantageous for a foreign government to read messages that were sent. And so I would think some of these diplomatic communications may be of more interest than some of the commercial messages that we have. It's not of no interest really for somebody in 30 years to see what you bought on Amazon, but maybe of interest to see what the embassy said to Washington, D.C. in 30 years, perhaps.
Yeah, or maybe software updates to electricity substations, which last for 30 years.
Yes, good point, yeah.
We've got a question now from Sébastien Vattière. Do you see an interesting future for homeomorphic machine learning, more generally cryptography allied to data and data-based algorithms?
Yeah, people are looking at all kinds of applications for cryptography to machine learning. One of the applications that's interesting is where people have data in one spot and they want to use computational facilities in some other spot to actually do the training of the neural net that they're using. But they want to do it in such a way that the system that's being provided to do the computation doesn't learn anything about the data or the resulting neural net. So you want to do computation in a way that protects the secrecy of the data, protects the secrecy of the structure of the neural net that's being computed and trained. And so homomorphic encryption, which has become a big field itself, comes to play here, and people are looking at better ways of doing that. With homomorphic encryption, you can operate on encrypted data in such a way that you take two, like the encryption of X and the encryption of Y, and you can come up with the encryption of X plus Y without ever decrypting X or decrypting Y. It involves some of the mathematical properties. RSA already has some homomorphic properties, as you can see. If you just multiply the encryption of X to the E times Y to the E, the encryption of Y, you get X times Y to the power E. And so you could get a multiplicative homomorphic property. But getting both of those together has been a challenge, and it wasn't until Craig Gentry proposed a scheme for doing that we finally figured out ways of doing fully homomorphic encryption. And that's being simplified and applied in all kinds of areas as we speak. It's become a hot area. It's still a challenge, but remember that in the early days, the public key was also a challenge. Things get faster over time. So I think that we'll see a lot more application of homomorphic encryption to areas such as machine learning, but also other areas as well.
Radzim Sendika says, suppose someone breaks RSA and posts the solution online. What will the next 24 hours look like?
Well, we have this issue with vulnerabilities being discovered in security systems all the time, and there's a process of responsible disclosure that usually happens, whereby the people who are if somebody's malicious and just wants to post it, maybe that's the scenario you're talking about. But if somebody who's an academic researcher actually figures out a way to factor quickly, they can demonstrate that they can factor quickly. They can say, here's a challenge number. And if you look at the Wikipedia under the page for RSA factoring challenge numbers, there's a whole list of numbers that we posted decades ago, and people are knocking them off one by one slowly as factoring gets better. So you can demonstrate that you have a good algorithm for factoring by taking a 1024-bit number or even a 2048-bit number and factoring that. And that number has been posted and the factor lost decades ago, but now that you can factor, you can say, look, you guys are using a system that's going to be insecure. I know how to factor numbers. Please fix up your systems. There are other schemes that are out there, and depending on the nature of the algorithm, many of the proposals, SSL and so on too, that use cryptography actually have a variety of algorithms implemented. You may be able to use a elliptic curve algorithm, and there are a lot of lattice-based algorithms that are secure, it seems, against quantum computation. So a lot of the cryptographic libraries have a suite of algorithms, not just RSA, and so people have switched over. But you raise a great question. It would be very painful. There are lots of people who are using RSA in ways that can't easily be changed. Anytime you change the underlying framework for what you're doing like this, it's going to be difficult, and I imagine there'll be a lot of blood on the ground when such a change happens.
Yes, I can remember all the fuss when things like Heartbleed caused people to upgrade cryptographic implementations. But Will Barnes has got a question. Cryptography is to an extent a tale of two communities, one developing fully in the open and another which collaborates with three-letter agencies, which has in the past led to standards with known backdoors like dual-EC, the random number generator being adopted. Where do you think the balance between these communities should lie?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. It's certainly changed. I mean, it used to be entirely 100%, military, diplomatic communications, and commercial coding was minuscule by comparison. Now the pendulum has swung the other way, and it's 99%, encryption to Google or Facebook or messages, Signal or other places. So it's driven by the market pressure to do these. That's, as I said, there's tension between these two communities. Certainly the commercial sector wants to see very much strong and unbreakable encryption without backdoors put in for law enforcement or government agents access, because those involve introduced weaknesses that may be exploited by the bad parties. So this dialogue will continue. Where the balance should lie, it's a hard technical challenge. We may have some brilliant technical innovations yet to happen, which will help resolve this issue. But basically, you've got an issue of who do you trust? And if you trust the person who's published the public key and you don't need to trust anybody else, you've got a fairly strong system. If you have to trust that party plus the governments of every country your message went through and it's through me to you, you have a much more fragile system. So I think it's as much a political question as it is a technical question. Who do you trust and what kind of architecture? And assuming you can build whatever you want, which seems to be pretty much the case these days, how do you architect a system that puts the trust balance in the right way? And getting the trust balance right is actually the hard part.
So another question from Dr. Atif Alvi. What do you think is the chance of P being equal to NP?
Chance of P being equal to NP?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know. People ask that. That's a great question. Certainly, if that happens, then cryptography would go up in flames. All of cryptography is based on the use of secret keys, and if you can guess a secret key and check it quickly, as a P equals NP type computer would be able to do, then cryptography would be very difficult, except for cryptography that's based on information theoretic principles. Right now, as I lightly indicated at the beginning, we're based on computational assumptions, but there is a brand of cryptography which is based on just there being too much information, too many possibilities for that to do this. The one-time pad is a great example of that. So there would be some ground we could retreat to, but it would be a disaster for cryptography. What are the chances of that happening? Small, but we know so little, it's hard to tell, right? It could happen, you know, within any day now that some graduate student comes up with this scheme for proving that P equals NP and gives us a fast algorithm, breaking not only all of cryptography, but solving many other hard problems that we have. So it would be a very mixed blessing. Cryptography would be on the bad side of that. Chances of that happening, I don't know. I would say maybe 2-3% over the next 5 or 6 decades. I'm terrible at making these predictions, of course.
Next question is from Simon Love. It seems like as blockchain technology gets applied more broadly, the resources that are consumed are expanding exponentially. Is there any hope that this can be controlled?
I think I do hope it's up. That's a great question, and I think climate change is something we all need to be working on. And as technologists, we need to say, is the technology we're using and developing one that is friendly to the environment? And Bitcoin, the way it's currently promulgated, is not. It involves expensive computations on the part of miners to solve puzzles that don't have any benefit to society other than just allowing them to claim that they've got the next block in the blockchain. That said, there are quite a few proposals out there which are based on proof of stake or other things. There's an Ethereum-based one. There's others by, one by my colleague, Silvio Macaulay at MIT, Algorand. There's many others for basing it on not how much computation power you have or use to solve a puzzle, but on the fact that you own a certain amount of the cryptocurrency. And so I think these are starting to take prominence. Elon Musk has talked about, the environmental impact of Bitcoin. Ethereum is starting to move towards a proof of stake system, as far as I can tell. So I think it's hard to tell. I mean, these are unregulated pretty much. Although China has recently come down hard on the Bitcoin miners that exist in China. So Bitcoin is starting to see headwinds in a way for its climate impact. But it's not a company that you can order around. These are open source technologies pretty much. And people choose on a market basis which one they want to use. I tend to be optimistic, though, that we'll be moving towards schemes which are more environmentally friendly than Bitcoin. So I think as the technology approaches and there's market pressure and there's environmental pressure, I think this will happen.
Great. Matthew Ireland asks, I'd be interested in what are Ron's preferred cryptography solutions in low power embedded systems with limited computational resources.
Yeah, I've looked at it a little bit. I mean, the NSA has come up with some proposals, Simon and once the Spectre, that was the break. But those have become under controversy recently. There's a lot of research on low power embedded systems, and I'm not the expert on which ones to choose there. So we can read the literature and see what ones have stood up recently. It takes a lot of care in developing a cryptographic algorithm to see that it's secure, particularly for these low power devices, because you're really at the edge of what you can compute efficiently. You need to use few cycles to do the encryption, few cycles to decrypt it correspondingly. And when you're so tight on computation, you tend to cut corners in ways that tend to make things insecure. So it's, if you have data that's going to be around for a long time, you probably want to go with one of the standards. AES was designed to be fairly efficient on low power devices, but by comparison with some of the newer algorithms, it uses quite a bit of computation. So I'd look at AES and some of the competitors and see which one you'd like. But I'm not the person to make recommendations here.
Great. Oliver Thorpe asks, is there any likelihood of a distributed certificate management solution that doesn't require trust in existing root certificate authorities such as VeriSign?
So certificates are statements binding, a name to a public key. And so if you issue a certificate, you are saying, I believe that this public key belongs to this person. It's a signed document by you, but then you need to be trusted in order for that certificate to be believable. And so if you don't have an intermediary who you trust, then you can't use public key cryptography. You don't know how to get the public key of the counterparty that you want to send a message to. So you need trusted intermediaries. So I think what you're asking for means you have to evaluate, who are the appropriate parties to trust and these kinds of things. You can have a distributed consensus mechanism where you maybe don't trust any particular party too well, but you trust a number of them. But they will all have to have some basis for claiming that this is Alice's public key. We can't just be leveraging off each other's statements. So you get to the real world considerations of who do you trust and why do you trust a statement being made like that. In addition, you have the concerns about whether something is still fresh or not. Even though Alice claimed this was her public key at a certain time, she may have lost her private key since. So you need online certificate status checks or some way of doing a real-time update to say, is there reason now still to believe that this is Alice's public key? So trust is the issue, figuring out who you trust to be the intermediaries. You may not want to accept a particular root key as the trusted one. There are many keys built into your browser that shouldn't be there probably. And you want to be able to pick and choose who you trust for it if it's appropriate. It's a difficult problem. It's international in scope, involves many intermediaries, and I think we still haven't solved it.
Continuing on the policy theme, Sebastian Bratier asks, in terms of policy and regulation, do you see parallels between regulation in the cryptography space back in the 1990s and AI regulation nowadays? Lessons we should learn?
They're both technological developments which have mixed blessings, right? I mean, cryptography is used by many of us for good purposes. It's used by a few people for bad purposes. Regulators say maybe we should be regulated. AI, similarly, facial recognition has some beneficial purposes, but it also has some surveillance purposes that may be objectionable, and along with other AI developments. So I think at that broad level, they're certainly similar, but cryptography tends to be much more explicit and focused on particular algorithms, particular key sizes, and so on too. So I think it's an easier target to regulate. AI tends to be very generic. What if you worry about things like, what if the AIs become smarter than we are and try to regulate us? I don't know how you think about these things. So I think that there's some similarity there, but AI is a much messier and broader area to think about.
Yeah. The next question is, given recent attacks on crypto from governments around the world, what do you envisage the goal of modern cryptography to be? And how does one deal with bad governments?
Well, I think there's a couple of roles that academic cryptographers can play. On the one hand, there's the pure research goals, like what can you do? Given the mathematics that's available, or new mathematics you might evolve, and the challenges that you have to build systems with particular patterns of trust or integrity that you want to establish. And it turns out that research is going well. It's been going strong for decades. There's so many interesting problems to look at, and it seems to be a meta theorem in cryptography that, in principle, whatever you'd like to build can be built, but there is the right mathematics to make it happen. We're discovering all the time that we can do things like fully homomorphic encryption or other things that turn out to be enormously useful. That's one hat. And then the other hat is, how as a member of society, how do you work with government agencies or people who are trying to understand how technology puts itself into everyday life? What should go on your smartphone? Who should have access to what's on your smartphone, and so on too. And these are policy decisions that you make not only as technologists, but you may advise on as citizens of the thing. And I think we have to point out that there are serious risks to building systems that are too easy for, say, law enforcement to read, because these may just provide backdoors that any bad guy may be able to access, or should he get access, he'd be able to read people's phones too easily. So I think these are things that the technologists should do. And these are debates which are worth having, and it's not clear where they're going to go in the end. I have my own set of more libertarian style viewpoints, but other people have other viewpoints, and this is a debate we could have as members of society.
Indeed. Joe Bonneau asks, if RSA and public key crypto were never invented, do you think e-commerce would have been less widely used, or would we have simply deployed large-scale Kerberos and not known what we were missing?
Good question. Kind of factual. Um, Probably we would have done Kerberos widely and not known what we were missing, I guess, right? If a public key had never been invented. What else do we have, right? And that would have been it.
Joe also asks, you worked on cryptocurrency in the mid-1990s and then seemed to move away from it. Did you give up at the time and think it was never going to catch on?
Great question. Yeah, Sylvia Macaulay and I had a company we founded called Peppercoin, which was an interesting technology. It was probabilistic in character. We viewed the problem as one of handling micropayments primarily, and we said if you want to pay somebody a penny, you pay them $1 with probability 1 in 100. So we built a company around that. The company didn't quite take off, in part because the credit card companies viewed it as a threat and didn't play ball with us. So I stepped back from that. Although Sylvia is working on a company which is working with a payment system, Algorand. I think payment systems are bread and butter to many cryptographers. I think they're going to be around. They're going to be widely used. Whether I play a role in them or not is less important. The field as a whole is definitely involved with cryptocurrencies and payment systems and thinking about how to architect a payment system in a secure way.
Mm-hmm. And another question from Redzim Sindika. Building on your work with free ballot, what security questions should be used in light of recent controversies around election integrity? And what will we need to make online voting systems feasible?
Well, those are great questions, and I could give a whole series of talks on those. I spend a lot of time on election integrity these days. It's sort of an interesting security area. The fact that you have secret ballots makes ordinary security technologies inapplicable in many ways. You can't have an audit trail in the same way because you can't provide records of who cast this ballot, for example. So you've got to be very careful about how you maintain the chain of custody of the ballot information. I tend to be very much against online voting. I think that the problems of online voting are just too severe to expect that we'll have online voting in a secure way soon. Someday, maybe. It's certainly a desirable goal, but we don't have the technology for doing it. And I think people that say, well, we just do this, forget that the purpose of an election is not only to produce the winner, and it's not hard to build a system where you type in a website who you're voting for and it tabulates that, but to convince the loser that they lost fair and square. The loser comes back and says, well, how does this website compute its result? What evidence does it have that I really lost? I think if you think about the problem that way, you realize it's a much harder problem, and that online solutions are maybe good at counting, but terrible at producing evidence. And so I think for the time being, sticking with paper ballots is really the way to go.
Yes, indeed. Wes Munsell asks, how did you get the big primes to get the RSA challenge numbers? Because after all, the Miller-Rabin test only came along in 1980.
I think I didn't write the code for that. Bert Kaliski was one of my PhD students, worked with Jim Bidzos and others to do that. They had a laptop, they coded it up. I don't know if the code exists even. There was some random number generation, of course, and then the primality testing. I think Miller-Rabin came in, what year was that? It was...
Not 1980, I believe.
I think that was, yeah, so the challenge numbers came after that. So we were using Miller-Rabin by the time. Probably that was what was implemented. The numbers, you can do a simple Fermat test. If a to the p-1 is congruent to 1 mod p, that's pretty strong evidence that p is prime if p is randomly chosen. And there's evidence that pseudoprimes which satisfy that equation and aren't prime are just so rare they can be ignored in practice. So it's a very simple practical check for primality.
Yes, well, there's just so many pieces had to come together over the years to give us the modern public key cipher suites, right?
Yes, yes.
Finally, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. It seems like Crypto War 1 ended with governments quietly shelving efforts after expensive failures. Do we hope the same for Crypto War 2, or is there a more defined win? Does the consolidation of platforms and services today make it easier or harder to win?
I think these are complex situations, and we can't expect sort of a clean resolution that one party just says, okay, I give up. We'll continue to see issues that trouble law enforcement, issues that trouble intelligence agencies with the use of cryptography. I think there's some disastrous paths we could end up going down to where the government ends up having a program in every smartphone monitoring what you do. I think that would be just a disastrous sort of authoritarian total surveillance kind of scenario. So I hope we can steer people away from that. But I expect this dialogue will continue, and people will continue to think about ways of trying to carefully delineate situations where perhaps some of these access patterns could be supported. I think there are not too many of those, and mostly we'll just see a lot of places where cryptography excels at what it does best, which is protecting the privacy and integrity of communications. And it's a double-sided sword, but we have that with many technologies, with cars and other things where there's a benefit, there's also a societal downside. We make the choice. And so I think for most of cryptography, we'll be taking the choices. Yeah, this is a good thing. This is what we should be doing. This is how you protect your data. This is how you know who you're talking to. And we don't abide by having governments get in the middle of any of that.
Well, absolutely. Well, it's been absolutely great to host you here in both Cambridge and Palo Alto, Ron. Many thanks again for giving our Distinguished Lecture 2021. We will have the video of it online in due course, no doubt in a few days once our audiovisual people have tidied it up. I expect that everybody will join me in applauding you and thanking you for this talk, and hoping that we'll get to meet you again in person one of these times when it's possible for us to, for you to visit Old Cambridge, or for us to go over there and visit New Cambridge. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Ron, so much. Thank you, everybody.